The late afternoon sun bled shades of gold and pink across the sky as Richard Sterling's limo purred through the ornate gates of his daughter's property, the Huntington estate. The 65-year-old real estate mogul adjusted his impeccably tailored suit, a nervous tic that had lingered even after decades of dominating the market. Something felt deeply wrong. The grounds, once a vibrant tapestry of color and life, were now neglected. Weeds had strangled the prize-winning roses Emily had so carefully cultivated. The main fountain, once a showpiece, now sputtered pathetically, its water green with algae. Richard Sterling's brow furrowed, the lines of concern deepening. It had been 6 months since his last visit, 6 months since Emily had suddenly stopped their weekly lunches. No butler appeared to greet him. The grand foyer, usually buzzing with life, was as quiet as a crypt. The sharp click of Richard's Italian leather shoes was the only sound against the polished marble as he moved forward, a sense of dread growing with every footfall. A sudden noise stopped him cold, something caught between a breath and a sob, emanating from the living room. Richard crept closer, his heart beginning to hammer against his ribs. The scene that met his eyes would be seared into his memory forever. 2 little girls, no older than 5, were on their knees on the gleaming hardwood floor. The dresses he recognized from last Christmas, now tattered and stained. Their blonde hair, once always styled in intricate braids, was now a matted, tangled mess. Lily and Grace, his cherished twin granddaughters, were scrubbing the floor with grimy rags. For a heartbeat, Richard was frozen, his mind refusing to accept the image before him. Then Grace looked up, her eyes so much like Emily's, widened with a mix of shock and terror. Grandpa. The voice was a raw whisper, as if it hadn't been properly used in a very long time. That sound shattered the spell. Richard dropped to his knees, his aging joints protesting, and flung his arms open. The girls hesitated for one gut-wrenching second before scrambling into his embrace. The scent of sweat and filth assaulted his senses as he held them close. His fingers discovered knots in their once silky hair and, more disturbingly, small, hard bumps on Lily's scalp. Scars. "My darlings, what happened?" Richard asked gently, fighting to keep his voice from breaking. "Where is your mom?" Lily buried her face in his suit jacket, her small frame racked with silent sobs. Grace, ever the more defiant of the two, cast a fearful glance over her shoulder before leaning close to whisper in her grandfather's ear. The story that spilled from her innocent lips sent a chill of ice through Richard Sterling's veins. As Grace spoke, the mogul's gaze raked over the room, details he'd missed before now screaming at him. Cigarette burns marred the arm of a leather sofa. A nearly empty bottle of expensive whiskey lay on its side near an armchair. And there, half concealed by a drape, was a leather belt, its buckle tarnished with something that looked sickeningly like dried blood. The tale that unfolded was a living nightmare. His vibrant, brilliant Emily, institutionalized in some so-called psychiatric facility. Chad, the son-in-law he'd never fully trusted, had morphed into a real-life monster. And his granddaughters, his precious girls, had been reduced to terrified house servants in their own home. When Grace finished her story, a suffocating silence blanketed the room. Richard felt something hot and wet tracing paths down his cheeks. Tears. He hadn't wept like this since his wife's funeral over a decade ago. Lily lifted her head, her wide blue eyes filled with alarm. A tiny hand reached up to her grandfather's face, wiping at a tear. "Don't cry, Grandpa," she whispered. "We're strong. Mommy told us to be strong." Something inside Richard shattered at that moment, but through the agony, a steely resolve he hadn't felt in years ignited. He was Richard Sterling, the man who built an empire from nothing, who stared down hostile takeovers and market crashes without flinching. And this was the most important battle of his life. Gently, Richard pulled the girls back, holding their small shoulders. His eyes, now dry and blazing with an internal fire, met theirs. "Listen to me, my darlings," he said, his voice low but weighted with an unbreakable promise. "From now on, everything changes. You're safe. I'm here now, and nothing bad will happen to you. Never again." The twins shared a look, a silent language only they possessed. Then, slowly, like flowers opening to the morning sun after a long, dark night, they smiled. The sound of a key turning in the front door lock echoed through the estate. The girls' smiles vanished instantly, replaced by masks of pure terror. "He's here," Grace whispered, her hand finding her sister's in a death grip. Richard rose to his feet, automatically smoothing his suit. His face settled into a mask of pure calm, the same one he wore before closing billion-dollar deals. But his eyes burned with an icy rage that would make the devil himself flinch. "Stay behind me, girls," he said softly. "It's time for Grandpa to have a talk with your stepfather." The creak of the front door echoed through the mansion like a dark omen. Richard felt the girls' small hands clutch his legs, trembling like leaves in the wind. He gently stroked their hair, a silent gesture of reassurance, before squaring his shoulders and fixing his gaze on the living room entrance. Chad Huntington entered with the arrogant confidence of a man used to dominating his environment. Tall, well-dressed, with a smile that never reached his cold eyes, he paused abruptly upon seeing Richard. "Well, well," Chad said, recovering quickly. "What a pleasant surprise, Mr. Sterling. To what do I owe the honor?" The insincerity in Chad's voice made Richard's stomach churn. "I came to see my granddaughters," he replied, keeping his tone calm but firm. "And it seems I arrived at the perfect time." Chad's eyes narrowed as he took in the scene, the girls still clinging to their grandfather's legs, the dirty rags on the floor, the toppled whiskey bottle. For an instant, a flash of something anger crossed his face before he forced a smile. "They were just playing," Chad said, tension seeping into his voice. "You know how kids are, imaginative." Richard felt his anger simmer in his chest. "Playing?" he echoed incredulously. "With filthy rags? Scrubbing the floor?" Chad shrugged, walking over to the bar. "They saw the maid doing it and wanted to imitate. I thought it might be educational." The sound of whiskey pouring into the crystal glass echoed in the tense silence. Richard watched, noting how Chad's hand shook slightly. "Where is Emily?" Richard asked, his voice dangerously low. Chad turned, glass in hand, a cold smile on his lips. "My dear wife is resting. The doctor recommended a specialized clinic. Business stress, you understand?" "Strange," Richard replied, his tone heavy with irony, considering she hasn't been involved in any business for months. Chad's smile flickered for a moment. He took a long sip of whiskey before responding. "Appearances can be deceiving, Mr. Sterling. Emily had issues. She was becoming a danger to herself and the children." The girls, still clinging to Richard's legs, let out small whimpers upon hearing those words. The businessman felt his rage rise, threatening to boil over. "The only danger I see here," Richard said, his voice trembling with contained fury, "is you." Chad, his son-in-law, laughed, a cold, humorless sound. "Careful, Mr. Sterling. You're making serious accusations based on what, exactly? The tears of two spoiled children?" Richard took a step forward, placing himself between Chad and the girls. "Based on what I see, the state of these children, the inexplicable absence of my daughter, the barely hidden bruises on Lily and Grace's arms." Chad's face hardened, every line showing his anger. All pretense of cordiality vanished. "You have no idea what you're talking about, old man. This is my house, my family. I suggest you leave before things get unpleasant." "Your family?" Richard repeated, incredulous. "These girls are my granddaughters. Emily is my daughter. And you're just an opportunist. I made the mistake of letting into our lives." Chad advanced, rage now evident in every contour of his face. "Watch what you say, Sterling. You might be powerful out there, but in here, I'm king, and I can make your life hell if I want." Richard did not back down. Decades of tough negotiations had prepared him for this moment. "Threats, Chad? Is that how you want to play this?" "They're not threats," Chad growled. "They're promises. Get out of my house, now, or I swear you will never see these girls or Emily again." The air in the room felt electrified, the tension thick. The twins sobbed quietly, clinging to each other behind Richard. "Do you really think you can stop me?" Richard asked, his voice dangerously calm. "I built an empire, Chad. I've faced competitors far more terrifying than you. If you think you can intimidate me, you're tragically mistaken." Chad laughed harshly and cruelly. "Oh, Sterling, so naive. You have no idea what I'm capable of, or the connections I have. One phone call and I can make you disappear. Or better yet, make Emily and the girls vanish forever." The words hung in the air like a poisonous cloud. Richard felt a chill run down his spine, but he held firm. "If you touch a single hair on their heads again," he said, each word loaded with a promise, "I swear I will devote every cent, every resource I have to destroying you. There will be no place in this world where you can hide from me." The two men glared at each other, the hostility between them palpable. Chad was the first to break eye contact, turning to pour himself more whiskey. "You have 5 minutes to leave my property," he said, his back turned to Richard. "After that, I'll call the police." Richard looked at his granddaughters, their large, frightened eyes fixed on him. His heart broke at the thought of leaving them, but he knew he had to be strategic. Kneeling, he hugged the girls tightly. "Be strong, my darlings," he whispered. "Grandpa will fix this, I promise." Standing up, he faced Chad one last time. "This isn't over," he said simply. As he walked to the exit, Richard could feel Chad's gaze burning into his back, but it was the muffled sounds of the twins' sobs echoing in his ears that fueled the fierce determination in his heart. Crossing the mansion's threshold, Richard Sterling made a silent vow. He would save his family, no matter the cost. And Chad Huntington would learn the hard way that he had made the biggest mistake of his life by underestimating a grandfather determined to protect those he loves. Richard Sterling sat in his limo, strategically parked a block away from his daughter's estate. His eyes, usually so sharp in business meetings, were clouded with worry and contained rage. The hands that had signed multi-million-dollar contracts without hesitation now trembled slightly as he gripped the steering wheel. The confrontation with Chad echoed in his mind, every threatening word feeding the growing resolve in his chest. Images of Lily and Grace, his precious granddaughters, in torn clothes, their frightened eyes, haunted him relentlessly. And overshadowing everything was the unexplained absence of Emily, his beloved daughter, weighing on his heart like an anchor. He could not leave them there. He could not take that risk. The decision crystallized in his mind like a diamond. He needed to get the girls out of that house now. With fingers struggling to remain steady, Richard picked up his phone. He made 3 quick, discreet calls, one to Goldberg, his trusted lawyer for decades, one to Jenkins, the head of his company's security, and one to Betty, his longtime loyal housekeeper. The instructions were clear, concise, and urgent. Goldberg was to prepare the necessary paperwork for a possible custody battle. Jenkins had to send his most reliable team immediately. Betty was to get bedrooms and supplies ready for 2 5-year-old girls. As he waited, Richard's mind worked feverishly, trying to piece together the puzzle. Where could Emily be? Chad had mentioned a clinic, but which one? Why hadn't she reached out? The questions mounted, each more disturbing than the last. 20 minutes later, minutes that felt like an eternity, a discreet armored sedan pulled up quietly behind the limousine. 2 men in well-tailored suits, Tony and Vinny, Jenkins's best security professionals, trained for high-risk situations and absolute discretion, stepped out. Richard greeted them with a tense nod, his eyes quickly scanning the perimeter for potential threats. "Gentlemen," he said, his voice low yet laced with authority, "we have a delicate and potentially volatile situation. My granddaughters are in imminent danger, and we need to remove them immediately." Tony and Vinny nodded, their faces expressions of professional focus, their eyes alert and sharp. Richard continued swiftly, outlining the situation, the layout of the mansion, and possible scenarios they might face. Discretion is crucial, he emphasized, his gaze hard as steel. If possible, I want to avoid a direct confrontation. But if Chad tries to stop us? He paused meaningfully, meeting the security officer's eyes. Do whatever is necessary to ensure the girl's safety. With a plan in place, the small group moved silently toward the estate. Richard's heart pounded against his ribs, a volatile mix of fear and determination coursing through his veins. As they approached the ornate gates, they saw movement. Chad was leaving, dressed elegantly, car keys to a sports car jangling in his hand. Richard and the security team quickly took cover in the shadows, watching Chad speed off, the roar of the sports car's engine echoing into the night. Now Richard whispered, a mixture of relief and urgency in his voice. They moved with calculated efficiency. Tony disabled the alarm system with professional precision while Vinny kept watch, his relaxed posture masking a state of absolute readiness. Richard led the way inside, his footsteps echoing in the oppressive silence of the mansion that had once been a happy home. "Lily? Grace?" he called softly, his voice filled with concern and hope. For an agonizing moment, there was no answer. The silence seemed to mock him, feeding his worst fears. Then, almost imperceptibly, there was a small sound from upstairs. Richard took the stairs 2 at a time, heart in his throat. He found them in the master bedroom, huddled together in a corner like frightened puppies. At the sight of him, their eyes, so similar to Emily's, widened with surprise and relief. "Grandpa!" Lily exclaimed, her voice a scared whisper that broke Richard's heart. "You came back." Richard knelt, ignoring his protesting knees, and opened his arms. The girls rushed to him, clinging as if their lives depended on it. And in a way, Richard thought grimly, maybe they did. "I'm here, my darlings," he murmured, kissing the tops of their heads and breathing in the familiar scent that brought back memories of happier times. "I've come to take you somewhere safe." Grace looked at him, her big, fearful eyes revealing an understanding beyond her years. But what about Chad? Richard felt a surge of anger at the fear in his granddaughter's voice. What kind of monster inspires such terror in a child? "He won't hurt you." "Ever again," he promised, his tone gentle but underscored by steely determination. "Grandpa will protect you, no matter what." Quickly, with Tony and Vinny's help, who kept a discreet lookout, Richard assisted the girls in gathering a few clothes and favorite toys into small backpacks. As they did, he couldn't help noticing the alarming signs of neglect in the room. Dirty laundry piled in a corner, dishes with leftover food on the nightstand, a teddy bear with a partially torn arm tossed on the floor. "Girls," he asked gently as they hurried downstairs, every step echoing the urgency of the situation, "do you know where your mommy is?" Lily and Grace exchanged a look that spoke volumes, a silent communication only twins seemed capable of. It was Lily who answered, her voice low and sad. Chad said she was sick, that she had to go away to get better. But she didn't say goodbye. "Mommy always says goodbye when she travels, even if it's just for a day," Grace added, tears shining in her blue eyes. Richard felt his heart twist painfully. What had Chad done to Emily? "Don't worry," he said, struggling to keep his voice confident. "We'll find her, I promise." They exited the mansion quickly, Tony and Vinny on high alert, their trained eyes scanning the environment nonstop. Richard helped the girls into the armored limousine, making sure they were comfortable and safe. As the car pulled away from the property in silence, Lily gazed out the tinted window, a tiny hand pressed against the glass as though she were trying to imprint the image of her house in her memory. "Grandpa," she asked, her voice trembling slightly, "when are we going back home?" The innocent question hit Richard like a punch to the gut. How could he explain to a 5-year-old that her home was no longer safe, that the man meant to protect them was in fact the biggest threat they'd ever faced? "For now, you're going to stay at Grandpa's house," he replied gently, choosing his words carefully. "Think of it like a long, fun vacation. How does that sound?" The girls nodded, but Richard could see the confusion and fear lingering in their eyes. Grace snuggled closer to him, her small voice almost a whisper as she posed the question Richard dreaded most. "Grandpa, why has Mommy been gone for so long? Doesn't she miss us?" The innocent question felt like a dagger to Richard's heart. He hugged Grace tighter, fighting the tears that threatened to fall. "I'm sure she misses you very, very much, my love," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "And we'll find her soon, I promise. Grandpa's going to bring Mommy back." As the limousine made its way to his mansion in an upscale suburb, Richard watched his granddaughters, now dozing off from exhaustion, their small hands entwined even in sleep. His heart was torn between relief at having rescued them and overwhelming concern for Emily. Where was she? In what condition would he find her? And how would Chad react when he discovered the girls were gone? Richard knew the battle was only beginning. There would undoubtedly be legal consequences. Chad would not easily relinquish control and power. But as he looked at his granddaughters sleeping peacefully, their angelic faces finally relaxed, Richard knew he would do anything, absolutely anything, to protect them. Picking up his phone, he made one more call. "Miller," he said to his longtime private investigator, his voice low so as not to disturb the girls, but charged with urgency. "I need you to find my daughter. Use every resource necessary. Money is no object. Comb through every clinic, every hospital, any possible place. Just bring her back to me. To us." Hanging up, Richard gazed out the window, watching the city blur by in a haze of lights and shadows. A familiar, ironclad determination settled in his chest, as natural as breathing. He would find Emily. He would protect Lily and Grace with his life if needed. And he would make Chad pay for every tear, every bruise, every moment of terror he had inflicted on Richard's family. The road ahead would be difficult, he knew, full of legal, emotional, and perhaps even physical obstacles. But Richard Sterling had never backed down from a challenge. And with what mattered most at stake, the safety and happiness of his family, he certainly wasn't about to start now. As the limousine approached the gates of his property, Richard made a silent promise to his sleeping granddaughters and his missing daughter. He would fix this, no matter the cost, no matter how long it took. He would rebuild his family, piece by piece, and protect them with every fiber of his being. The battle for his family had only just begun, and Richard Sterling was more than ready for the fight. The office at Sterling Enterprises, normally a sanctuary of calm and power, now pulsed with a frenetic energy. Piles of documents covered every available surface, computer screens flashed graphs and complex spreadsheets, and the air was thick with the strong aroma of coffee that no one had time to drink. Richard, with deep circles under his eyes betraying nights of lost sleep, was hunched over his laptop, fingers flying over the keyboard as he delved into the family business's financial records. Next to him, Susan, his chief accountant trusted for 2 decades, frowned at a stack of bank statements. "Here," Susan said suddenly, her voice tense. "Another suspicious transfer. $5 million to an account in the Cayman Islands." Richard's stomach turned. It was the 3rd transaction of this kind they had uncovered in the last few hours. "Date?" he asked, his voice hoarse from exhaustion. 3 months ago, right after Emily disappeared." The silence that followed was heavy with grim implications. Richard closed his eyes for a moment, allowing himself a brief instant of anguish before returning to the task at hand. "Keep tracking," he ordered, his voice regaining its usual firmness. "I want to know where every cent has gone in the last 2 years." As the team worked, Richard couldn't help reflecting on how they had reached this point. Only a week ago, his biggest concern was the next quarterly report. Now he was unearthing what appeared to be a massive fraud perpetrated by the man he trusted with his daughter and grandchildren. A pattern was emerging, as clear as it was disturbing. Small discrepancies at first, almost imperceptible. Then, gradually, the amounts grew. Phantom accounts in tax havens, questionable investments in shell companies, and always, money vanishing into a maze of obscured transactions. "Sir," called Kevin, one of the junior analysts, his voice shaking slightly. "I think I've found something." Richard quickly moved over, the rest of the team gathering around the young man's screen. It's an account in Geneva, Kevin explained, pointing to a series of numbers on the monitor. It's received regular transfers for the past 18 months. Very large amounts. Richard felt the blood turn cold in his veins. The date of the first transfer nearly matched the wedding of Emily and Chad. "How much?" he asked, dreading the answer. Kevin swallowed hard. "So far? Over 50 million. A shocked murmur rippled through the room. Richard felt his legs weaken, leaning heavily on the desk for support. "Susan," he said after a moment, his voice dangerously calm, "call Miller. Tell him I need him here. Now." While waiting for the renowned private investigator to arrive, Richard and his team continued to uncover more evidence of Chad's fraud. Each discovery was like a stab to the heart, a betrayal not just financial, but deeply personal. Miller arrived an hour later, his face showing concern the moment he saw the state of the office and of Richard. "Richard," he said, using the informal name their years of friendship allowed. "What's going on?" In response, Richard simply gestured at the screens and piles of documents scattered around. "See for yourself." Miller spent the next 30 minutes absorbing the information, his expression growing darker with each passing minute. When he finished, he turned to Richard, his eyes grim. "This is bigger than a simple corporate fraud, Richard," Miller said gravely. "The level of sophistication, the scale, it has all the hallmarks of a professional money laundering operation." Richard felt as if the ground had disappeared beneath his feet. "Money laundering?" he repeated in disbelief. "Are you saying Chad?" "I'm saying," Miller interrupted gently, "that your son-in-law probably has connections far beyond the corporate world. Dangerous connections." The ensuing silence was deafening. Richard looked at his team, seeing the fear and concern on their faces. He knew they were thinking not just of the company, but also of Emily and the girls. "What do we do now?" Susan finally asked, her voice trembling slightly. Richard straightened his shoulders, years of crisis leadership kicking in. "We keep digging," he said firmly. "Miller, I want you to use every resource at your disposal. Find out everything you can about Chad, his activities, his connections, his movements over the last few years." Turning to his team, he continued, "You have my full trust and gratitude. We're doing more than protecting the company here. We're fighting for my family, for Emily's and the girls' safety." The determination in his voice seemed to energize the room. The team went back to work with renewed vigor, fatigue momentarily forgotten. As Richard watched his team work, he felt a mixture of pride and apprehension. They were unearthing a web of corruption and deception that reached far beyond anything he could have imagined. But each discovery, each hidden account, and suspicious transaction they exposed was one step closer to finding Emily and protecting his granddaughters. The road ahead would be dangerous, he knew. Chad had resources, connections, and apparently few scruples. But Richard Sterling was not a man easily intimidated. With his fortune, his intelligence, and most importantly, his love for his family, he was ready for the fight of his life. As the night wore on and the investigation deepened, one thing was clear. The truth, however painful, would come to light. And when it did, Richard would be ready to see justice served, no matter the cost. The phone rang at 3:47 a.m., shattering the silence of the Sterling mansion. Richard, who had barely managed to doze off in his office, answered before the second ring. "We found her." Miller's voice, usually so controlled, trembled with emotion. "Richard, we found Emily." Richard's world stopped for an instant. "Where?" he whispered, scarcely daring to believe. "A private clinic in the mountains called Serenity Pines Sanitarium." Richard felt a chill creep down his spine. Serenity Pines. What a grim name for a clinic. "I'm on my way to your office," Miller continued. "You need to see this in person." 30 minutes later, Miller spread a series of documents across Richard's desk. Surveillance photos showed an imposing structure nestled among snow-capped peaks. It looked more like a fortress than a place of healing. "We gained access to the clinic's internal records," Miller explained, his voice grave. Emily was admitted 8 months ago, supposedly suffering from severe psychotic episodes and self-destructive tendencies. Richard felt his stomach churn. "Impossible," he muttered. "Emily was always the most balanced person I know." Miller nodded grimly. "Exactly. And here's where it gets even darker." He pulled out another document, this one bearing the letterhead of a well-known psychiatrist. "This is the report that authorized Emily's commitment. Looks legit at first glance, but—" Richard studied the document, narrowing his eyes. "Wait a moment. This signature. I know Dr. Lawrence. He treated my wife before she died. But that looks nothing like his signature." "Because it isn't," Miller confirmed. "It's a sophisticated forgery, and it's not the only one." In the following minutes, Miller revealed a tapestry of lies and manipulations that made Richard feel ill. Fabricated medical records, forged testimony from concerned friends, even carefully edited videos designed to make Emily look unstable. "My God," Richard muttered, running a hand through his graying hair. "How did Chad manage all this?" "Money," Miller replied simply. "A lot of money, and we suspect some underworld connections. We're still investigating." Richard stood abruptly, unable to remain still. "We need to get her out of there. Immediately." Miller raised a cautionary hand. "It's not that simple, Richard. This clinic isn't a typical facility. It has near military-level security. And legally, with all these official documents, Emily is there voluntarily." "Voluntarily?" Richard exploded. "She was kidnapped, drugged, and imprisoned." "I know," Miller said gently, "but we have to be careful. One wrong move, and Chad could just transfer her somewhere else, maybe even out of the country." Richard closed his eyes, struggling to control his rage and fear. When he opened them again, there was a fierce determination in his gaze. "What do you suggest, then?" Miller gave a faint smile, a glimmer of his usual cunning self shining through his concern. "First, we need eyes on the inside. I managed to book you a visit to the clinic as a potential investor." Richard nodded slowly. "And then?" "Then, depending on what we find, we plan an extraction. But, Richard," Miller added, his voice serious, "you need to be prepared. 8 months in that place, probably heavily medicated. Emily may not be the same person you remember." Richard's heart clenched painfully, his brilliant, lively Emily locked away in that cold place for so long. What had Chad done to her? "When can I go?" he asked, his voice raw with restrained emotion. "Tomorrow," Miller replied. "The jet is being prepped as we speak." The next few hours were a whirlwind of preparations. Richard was briefed on his false identity, memorized floor plans of the clinic, and was fitted with discreet listening devices. As he prepared to sleep or try to, Richard paused by the bedroom where Lily and Grace slept peacefully. Watching his granddaughters, he felt a renewed wave of determination. "I'll bring your mother back," he whispered, more to himself than to the sleeping girls. "I promise." The next morning, as the private jet took off toward the snowy peaks, Richard stared out the window, his thoughts full of Emily. What would he find in that ominous clinic? In what state would he find his daughter? One thing was certain: he would not leave without answers. And if his suspicions were confirmed, not all the money or connections Chad possessed would save him from the wrath of a father determined to save his child. As the clouds rolled by, Richard closed his eyes, allowing himself a brief moment of vulnerability. "Hold on, Emily," he murmured. "Dad is coming." The limo wound its way along the twisting mountain road that led to the mountaintop, every turn revealing more of the imposing structure of Serenity Pines Sanitarium. Richard, impeccably dressed in the role of a wealthy investor, adjusted his tie for the 10th time, a nervous gesture betraying his inner anxiety. As they neared the clinic gates, Richard took a deep breath, mentally running through his cover story. He was Gustav Miller, a successful entrepreneur looking to invest in luxury wellness institutions, a necessary lie to penetrate the fortress holding his daughter captive. The security at the gates was formidable, their piercing stares examining every detail of the documents presented. Richard maintained a neutral expression, years of tense negotiations serving him well in this crucial moment. After what seemed like an eternity, the gates opened with a foreboding screech. The limo traveled a driveway lined with meticulously maintained gardens, a facade of tranquility that made Richard's skin crawl. The outward beauty only made the horrors inside those walls more sinister. At the main entrance, a middle-aged woman with a forced smile awaited him, her eyes cold and calculating, belying her warm tone. "Welcome to Serenity Pines, Mr. Miller. I'm Dr. Eleanor Reed, the clinic director. It's a pleasure to have you." Richard shook her hand, noting the firm, dry grip. "The pleasure is mine, Dr. Reed. I'm looking forward to seeing your renowned facility." The tour began, with Dr. Reed emphasizing their cutting-edge treatments and serene environment. Richard took it all in with eagle eyes, his senses on high alert. He noticed the discreetly placed cameras at each corner, the advanced security on every door, the nurses whose friendly smiles did little to hide their vigilant stares. "And what about the patients?" Richard asked casually as they walked down a particularly quiet corridor. "I imagine you handle delicate cases." Dr. Reed smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. "Our patients come from influential families that value discretion above all else, Mr. Miller. I'm sure you understand the importance of that in our line of work." Richard nodded, a wave of nausea washing over him that he fought to suppress. How many other Emilys were locked up here, hidden from the outside world, victims of conspiracies and greed? Then it happened. As they passed an apparently ordinary hallway, Richard glimpsed a familiar figure through a slightly open door. His heart froze, and for a moment he forgot how to breathe. Emily. She was sitting on a chair, staring out the window with a vacant gaze. Her once lustrous hair, now dull and unkempt, draped limply around her face. She looked like she had lost a significant amount of weight. Her hollow cheeks and sunken eyes stood out against pale, lifeless skin. "Ah," said Dr. Reed, noticing Richard's intent stare. "One of our long-term patients. A fascinating case of—" But Richard barely heard her. He took an involuntary step toward the door, momentarily forgetting his cover. "May I?" he began, his voice faltering. Clearing his throat, he tried to regain composure. "May I take a closer look? You know, as an example of the type of patient you treat." Dr. Reed hesitated, her eyes narrowing slightly. For one terrible moment, Richard feared he had given himself away. But then she nodded. Briefly, she said, her tone making it clear she was making an exception. "And please, don't get too close. Some patients can be unpredictable." They entered the room. Emily did not move, continuing to stare out the window as though the outside world was far more interesting than anything behind those walls. "Emily, Doctor," Reed called softly. "You have a visitor today. Isn't that exciting?" Slowly, as though every movement was a monumental effort, Emily turned her head. Her eyes, which Richard remembered as vibrant and bright, were now dull and distant. For a fleeting moment, he thought he saw a spark of recognition, a glimmer of the Emily he knew, but it vanished as quickly as it came, swallowed by the fog of apathy enveloping her. "Hello?" Emily said, her voice so faint and raspy it was almost inaudible. Richard felt his heart shatter into 1,000 pieces. He wanted to scream, to shake her, to hug her, and take her away that very instant. But he knew he couldn't. Not yet. Not if he wanted any real chance of saving her. "Hello?" he managed, struggling to keep his voice steady. How are you feeling today?" Emily blinked slowly, as if the question was too complex to process. "Tired?" she finally muttered. "Always so tired." Dr. Reed intervened quickly, a forced smile on her lips. "Emily is making wonderful progress," she said, ushering Richard away from the chair with a firm hand on his elbow. "But as you can see, she still needs plenty of rest and constant care." As they were guided away, Richard cast one last glance at his daughter. She had already turned back to the window, as though the brief interaction had drained all her energy. The rest of the tour passed in a blur for Richard. He observed everything with new eyes, each detail now tinged with a sinister significance. Doctors whispering in corners, exchanging meaningful glances. Nurses with syringes always at the ready to calm down any agitated patient. Muffled sounds behind locked doors that Dr. Reed explained away as advanced sound therapy. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the tour ended back at the main entrance. Dr. Reed regarded Richard with an expression that was half expectant, half wary. "I hope you found our institution interesting, Mr. Miller," she said, extending her hand for a final shake. Richard forced what he hoped was a convincing smile, aware this moment could determine whether he'd have future access to the clinic. "It was certainly enlightening," he replied, shaking her hand. "I'll be in touch soon to discuss possible investments." As the limousine descended the winding mountain road, Richard finally allowed his emotions to overwhelm him. Silent tears streamed down his face as he replayed every detail of the visit, every glimpse of his broken daughter. With trembling hands, he picked up the phone and dialed Miller. "She's there," he said the moment the investigator answered, his voice raw with pent-up emotion. "But Miller? What they've done to her? My God, what have they done to my girl?" There was a pause on the other end, the silence heavy with mutual understanding and shared resolve. When Miller spoke, his voice was firm. "We'll get her out of there, Richard, whatever it takes." Richard looked back through the rear window, watching the clinic grow smaller in the distance, a white fortress against the blue sky of the mountains. His mind was already formulating plans, strategies, ways to tear down that terrible place and everyone involved. "Yes," he said, his voice now loaded with iron determination. "We'll get Emily out, and then we'll make every person involved in this pay, no matter how long it takes, no matter what it costs. I'll tear that place down brick by brick if I have to." As the limousine continued its descent, taking him back to civilization, Richard Sterling made a silent vow to the daughter he had left behind in the clutches of that nightmare disguised as a sanctuary. He would return, and next time he would not leave without her. The battle for Emily's soul and freedom was only beginning, and Richard Sterling, with all his wealth, influence, and paternal love, was more than ready for the impending war. Nothing would stop him from bringing his daughter home and seeking justice. Richard Sterling had barely slept since his visit to the clinic. The image of Emily, pale and broken, haunted his thoughts. With renewed determination, he called an urgent meeting in his private office at Sterling Enterprises. Around the large conference table sat Miller, his longtime investigator, and a new face, Dr. Sarah Klein, a renowned forensic psychiatrist known for exposing medical fraud. "Gentlemen, Dr. Klein," Richard began, his voice urgent, "we need to find out exactly what's happening at that clinic and how Chad managed to get Emily committed there." Miller nodded, opening a thick folder. "I've already started digging, Richard, and what we've found so far, it's disturbing, to say the least." Over the next few minutes, Miller outlined a series of lies and corruption that made Richard's blood boil. Meticulously falsified medical records, forged testimony from concerned friends, and even carefully edited videos to make Emily appear unbalanced. "But this is the worst of it," Miller said, pulling out a document bearing the letterhead of a well-known psychiatrist. "The report that authorized Emily's commitment is a sophisticated forgery." Richard examined the paper, his eyes narrowing. "I know Dr. Lawrence. He treated my wife before she passed. But that's not his signature." Dr. Klein took the document, her expert eyes scanning every detail. "Impressive," she murmured. "Whoever did this is a professional. But there are small inconsistencies. This line here, the pen pressure there. It's definitely a forgery." Richard felt a wave of anger and nausea. How did Chad pull this off? "Money," Miller said simply. "A lot of it. And connections in the underworld we're still untangling." "Doctor." Klein flipped through other documents, her face growing darker by the page. Mr. Sterling, this goes far beyond simple fraud. The medication regimen prescribed for your daughter is brutal. High doses of antipsychotics, powerful sedatives. If she's actually receiving all of this—" "She is," Richard interrupted, recalling Emily's catatonic state. "I saw her. She could barely speak." The psychiatrist shook her head, visibly troubled. "That explains it. Under such a cocktail of meds, it's a wonder she's even conscious. They're essentially keeping her in a constant state of sedation." Richard stood up abruptly, unable to contain his agitation. Why? Why do this to her? Miller and Dr. Klein exchanged a look before Miller answered. "Control, Richard. As long as Emily is incapacitated, Chad has total control over the family business, over the children, over everything." "There's more," Dr. Klein added hesitantly. "Based on these records, it looks like they're experimenting on her." "Experimenting?" Richard repeated, horrified. "Unapproved medications, unconventional therapies. The clinic is using patients as guinea pigs to test experimental treatments. And with the money Chad is funneling there—" Richard felt his legs give out, collapsing heavily into his chair. The idea of his daughter being used as a subject in illegal medical experiments was almost too much to bear. "We need to get her out," he said, his voice quivering with emotion and resolve. "Now." Miller leaned forward, his expression serious. "It's not that simple, Richard. Legally, with all these official documents, Emily is there voluntarily. A forced removal could be seen as kidnapping." "Kidnapping?" Richard exploded. "She was the one kidnapped, drugged, and confined against her will." "I know," Miller said softly, "but we have to tread carefully. One wrong move, and Chad could just move her again, maybe even out of the country." Dr. Klein cleared her throat, drawing their attention. "There is a possibility. If we gather solid proof of these forged documents and inadequate treatment, we can petition for an independent evaluation order." Richard nodded slowly, his mind racing. "And if that evaluation proves Emily is being held illegally, then we'll have legal grounds to remove her," Miller concluded. "But it will take time," Dr. Klein warned. "And meanwhile, Emily continues receiving this harmful treatment." Richard closed his eyes for a moment, the weight of the situation crushing him. When he opened them, a fierce determination glowed within. "We'll work on two fronts," he decided. "Dr. Klein, I want you to compile a detailed report on every medical and legal inconsistency you've found. Miller, keep investigating Chad's connections and the clinic. I want every dirty penny traced." "And you?" Miller asked, though he already suspected the answer. "I'm going back to that clinic," Richard said, his tone brooking no argument. "As the interested investor. I'll observe, ask questions, try to see Emily again if I can. The more inside information we have, the better." Richard's determination was palpable, energizing the room. They had a long road ahead, but for the first time since discovering Emily's situation, Richard felt they had a real chance. "One last thing," he added, his voice softening at the thought of his granddaughters. "Lily and Grace need to know we're working on bringing their mother back. Not all the details, of course, but enough to give them hope." Miller and Dr. Klein nodded in understanding. As the meeting ended and the plans were set in motion, Richard gazed out his office window toward the mountains where Emily was held. "Hold on, my dear," he murmured. "We're coming." The battle for Emily's truth and freedom was just beginning, but Richard Sterling was more determined than ever to win this war, no matter the cost. The office at Sterling Enterprises, typically a haven of calm and authority, now buzzed with frantic energy. Around the large conference table sat a carefully chosen team of professionals, each an expert in their field. Goldberg, Richard's longtime attorney, sifted through a stack of legal documents. Next to him, Dr. Sarah Klein, the forensic psychiatrist, pored over medical records with keen eyes. Miller, the private investigator, projected photos and diagrams of the clinic onto a large screen. And rounding out the group was Detective Harding, an old friend of Richard's from the police force. Richard rose, his imposing presence instantly silencing the room. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice resonating with determination. "Today we finalize our plan to rescue my daughter, Emily, and expose the illegal activities at Serenity Pines. Each of you has a critical role." Goldberg spoke first. "I've prepared a detailed legal petition contesting Emily's commitment," he explained, holding up a thick document. "Based on the evidence we've gathered about forged documents and false diagnoses, we have a solid case for demanding an immediate, independent evaluation." Dr. Klein nodded, picking up the thread. "My forensic report outlines the inconsistencies in the medical records and the abusive medication regimen. I've also assembled an independent team of experts ready to conduct a full assessment of Emily as soon as we get access." Miller stepped to the screen, pointing to a diagram of the clinic. "We've mapped every entrance, exit, and security camera. We've also identified potential allies among the staff nurses and assistants who seem uncomfortable with the clinic's practices. They could be crucial to ensuring our access to Emily." Detective Harding cleared his throat, drawing everyone's attention. "On the legal side, we're ready to act once we have the court order. I'll personally lead a team to the clinic. We also have warrants to search and seize evidence so nothing can be destroyed." Richard nodded gravely, absorbing each detail. The plan was taking shape, each piece fitting meticulously. But one crucial element still weighed heavily on his mind. "What about Chad?" he asked, his tone growing harder at the mention of his son-in-law. "He certainly won't stand by while we dismantle his scheme." Miller offered a sly smile. "We have that covered. Our contacts indicate that Chad is planning a business trip abroad next week. I suggest we act then, when he's out of the country and less able to interfere." A small spark of satisfaction flared in Richard's eyes. It was almost poetic that Chad's greed provided the perfect chance for Emily's rescue. "Excellent," he said. "Now, there's one delicate matter we need to address. Lily and Grace." The mention of the twins brought a collective wave of emotion through the room. Everyone present knew the trauma the girls had endured and how the return of their mother might impact them. Dr. Klein leaned forward, her expression softening. "I've been working with a child psychologist specializing in trauma. She's drafted a plan to help the girls process what's happening and prepare them for their mother's possible return. It's vital we be gentle and honest with them, without burdening them with disturbing details." Richard nodded, feeling a lump in his throat. "I'll talk to them tonight. They deserve to know we're close to bringing their mom home." The rest of the meeting was spent refining details, rehearsing scenarios, and ensuring every part of the plan was foolproof. By the time they finished, the sun was already setting, bathing the office in golden tones. As the team prepared to leave, Richard stopped them. "I want to thank each of you," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "What we're doing isn't just about Emily. It's about justice and doing what's right. I'll never forget what you're risking for my family." With firm handshakes and determined looks, the team dispersed, each member fully aware of the crucial days ahead. Alone in his office, Richard allowed himself a brief moment of vulnerability. He walked to the window, gazing down at the city below, thinking of Emily locked away in that cold clinic, and Lily and Grace eagerly waiting for any news of their mother. Lifting his phone, he made a call. "Betty, please get the girls ready. I'll be home in an hour to talk with them." Hanging up, Richard took a deep breath, preparing himself for the difficult conversation he was about to have with his granddaughters. They were so young, yet had faced so much. He only hoped that soon he could give them the news they'd been longing for. Their mother was coming home. Driving home, Richard felt the tension in his chest grow. The coming days would be crucial. Every move had to be perfectly timed, every detail meticulously executed. The slightest mistake could cost not only Emily's freedom, but potentially her life. Yet, as he neared his house, seeing the welcoming lights shining through the windows, Richard felt a surge of renewed determination. For Emily, for Lily, and Grace, for his family, he would face any obstacle. The plan was set. The team was ready. Now it was a race against time to rescue Emily and expose the truth before it was too late. Dawn broke cold and gray, as though the sky itself reflected the tense mood. Richard Sterling, accompanied by his team, arrived at the gates of Serenity Pines Sanitarium in a convoy of official vehicles. Detective Harding led the group, court order in hand, while Dr. Klein and a medical team waited anxiously to assess Emily. As they stepped up to the entrance, Richard felt his heart pounding. Months of planning, investigation, and anguish had led to this moment. "Police authorities, we have a court order," Detective Harding's voice boomed over the intercom. A tense moment of silence ensued before the gates began to open slowly. Dr. Eleanor Reed, the clinic director, awaited them at the entrance, her face a mask of feigned concern. "Detective, this is highly irregular. Our patients require peace." "And Dr. Reed," Richard interrupted, his voice laden with authority, "we're here to get my daughter, Emily Sterling, and investigate this institution's practices. Please cooperate." The director's professional facade cracked momentarily, revealing a flicker of panic. "Mr. Sterling, surely this is some misunderstanding. Your daughter is here voluntarily, under treatment," and Detective Harding stepped forward, presenting the documents. "Dr. Reed, we have substantial evidence of medical fraud and forced confinement. I suggest full cooperation or you'll face additional charges for obstructing justice." The confrontation that followed was tense. Doctors and nurses were questioned, documents seized, and every corner of the clinic combed through. Richard, accompanied by Dr. Klein and 2 officers, headed straight for Emily's room. Opening the door, the sight before them shattered Richard's heart. Emily sat in the same chair he'd seen before, staring vacantly out the window. She looked even more frail, if that were possible. "Emily," Richard called softly, stepping in cautiously. Slowly, as though awakening from a deep dream, Emily turned her head. Her eyes, once clouded, seemed to gain a flicker of clarity upon recognizing her father. "Dad?" she whispered, her voice raspy from disuse. Tears sprang to Richard's eyes. "Yes, my dear, I'm here. We're taking you home." Dr. Klein moved in gently, explaining the situation in a comforting tone. Meanwhile, the medical team performed an initial evaluation. "She's heavily sedated," Dr. Klein informed Richard after a few minutes. "We'll need a careful detox protocol, but she's stable enough for transfer." With infinite care, Emily was prepared to leave the clinic. Richard never left her side, holding her hand and murmuring words of reassurance. Leaving the clinic felt surreal, a blur of activity and chaos. Reporters had gathered at the gates, drawn by the police presence. Richard shielded Emily as best he could, guiding her into a waiting ambulance. During the drive to a secure private hospital, the Oakwood Private Medical Center, Richard observed his daughter. Moments of lucidity alternated with periods of confusion, but there was undeniable relief in her eyes. "The girls?" Emily asked at one point, her voice barely audible. "They're fine, my love," Richard assured her, gently squeezing her hand. "They can't wait to see you." At the hospital, Emily was quickly moved into a private suite. A team of specialists, led by Dr. Klein, began the delicate process of detox and evaluation. While Emily received her initial care, Richard made the call his heart had ached for over the long months. "Betty, bring the girls. It's time." An hour later, Lily and Grace arrived at the hospital, their small faces filled with a mix of anxiety and hope. Richard knelt before them, explaining the situation gently. "Remember what we talked about," he said softly. "Your mom is very tired and might look a bit different, but she loves you more than anything." The reunion was heartbreaking in its tenderness. Emily, still weak but more alert after the initial treatments, opened her trembling arms. The twins hesitated a moment before running into their mother's embrace. "My babies," Emily whispered, tears streaming down her face as she held them close. "I missed you so much." Richard watched, his own cheeks wet with tears. This was just the beginning of a long road to recovery, he knew. Emily would need time, care, and plenty of love to heal. The girls, too, faced a challenging adjustment, but at that moment, seeing his family reunited, Richard felt a wave of hope and resolve. They had survived the worst. Together, they could face whatever came next. In the days that followed, the family settled into a secluded, highly secure country house, the Lakeside Retreat. Emily began an intensive detox and therapy program, while the twins received psychological support to cope with the trauma and changes. Richard divided his time between caring for his family and handling the legal and media fallout. Exposing the clinic's fraud had opened a Pandora's box, with investigations spreading across the mental health sector. In the evenings, seated on the porch, watching Emily and the girls playing in the yard, Richard reflected on how far they had come. The path to full healing was still long, but for the first time in a while, the future looked bright. The battle to rescue Emily was over. Now began the journey of rebuilding their lives and their love as a family. The shrill ring of the phone cut through the quiet morning air at the Lakeside Retreat. Richard, who was preparing breakfast for the family, answered quickly, not wanting to disturb Emily and the girls, who were still asleep. "Mr. Sterling," came Goldberg's tense voice. "Chad is back. And he's furious?" Richard felt a chill run down his spine. They had known this day would come, but the reality was more terrifying than they'd imagined. The next hours brought chaos. Chad, using his substantial influence and resources, launched an aggressive campaign on multiple fronts. First came the legal actions. Goldberg called again, sounding exhausted. He's contesting Emily's release, claiming she's a danger to herself and the kids. He's demanding an emergency hearing to reconsider her custody. Richard clenched his fists, anger boiling in his chest. He has no evidence. We have all the documentation showing the fraud. Yes, but he's playing dirty, Goldberg explained. He's submitting edited videos of Emily at her worst moments in the clinic, painting a picture of instability. As Richard digested this news, Miller, his investigator, burst into the kitchen, laptop in hand. "You need to see this," he said gravely, spinning the screen for Richard. On the screen, a solemn-faced news anchor spoke. Sources close to the Sterling family claimed that heiress Emily Sterling was kidnapped from a mental health clinic by her father, putting her own safety and that of her twin daughters at risk. Richard watched, horrified, as Chad appeared on camera, his expression a perfect mask of worry and sorrow. "I only want my wife to get the treatment she needs," he said, his voice thick with obvious falseness. "And I want to protect my daughters. They're not safe with someone in such a fragile mental state." "He's manipulating the media," Miller said, closing the video. "Planting stories, spreading rumors. He's trying to sway public opinion to his side." Richard felt the weight of the world on his shoulders. He had expected a tough fight, but Chad's cruelty and cunning took him by surprise. At that moment, Emily entered the kitchen, her face pale and her eyes wide with fear. "I heard," she said softly. He's coming after us, isn't he?" Richard crossed the kitchen in 3 long strides, wrapping Emily in a protective hug. "I won't let him hurt you again," he vowed fiercely. "Or the girls." But the threats kept piling up. Security reports indicated Chad had hired private investigators to track the family's location. There were hacking attempts on the property's security systems. One particularly tense afternoon, Richard received an anonymous call. The voice on the other end was cold and threatening. "We know where you are. If you don't return Emily and the children, there will be consequences." Security around the property was bolstered. Richard hired additional guards and installed state-of-the-art surveillance. The Lakeside Retreat, once a peaceful retreat, became a fortress. Emily, still fragile from her ordeal, struggled to remain composed as the threats mounted. One night, Richard found her sitting in the dark, staring anxiously out the window. "What if he succeeds?" she whispered, her voice trembling. "What if he takes me back to that place? Or worse, what if he takes the girls?" Richard knelt beside her, taking her hands in his. "I won't let that happen," he said firmly. "We'll fight him with everything we have." But the pressure continued to build. The twins, sensitive to the tension around them, began having nightmares. Lily woke up screaming, convinced the bad man was coming to get them. Grace became quiet and withdrawn, clinging to Emily like a shadow. The moment of greatest danger arrived when Chad made his boldest move yet. Using his connections, he obtained a temporary court order granting him the right to visit the children. "It's a trap," Goldberg warned over the phone. "He'll use this opportunity to try to take them." Richard gathered the family in the living room, his face grim. "We need to prepare," he said. "Chad will be here tomorrow, supposedly to see the girls. But we can't trust him." Emily hugged her daughters protectively. "I won't let him take them," she said, a spark of her old strength lighting her eyes. They spent the night planning. Escape routes were established, secret codes devised with the girls, and the security team was strategically placed around the property. The next morning, tension hung in the air like a heavy cloud. Richard stood by the window, his body rigid with anxiety, as Chad's car pulled in through the gates. Emily sat on the couch, Lily and Grace nestled against her. Her eyes met Richard's in a silent message. Whatever happened, they would face it together. The doorbell's ring echoed through the house. Richard took a deep breath, straightened his shoulders, and walked to the door. The moment they all feared had arrived. As he turned the doorknob, Richard knew that whatever happened in the next few minutes could change his family's fate forever. But he was ready to protect those he loved, no matter the cost. The door swung open, revealing Chad, a cold smile on his lips. The final showdown was about to begin. Richard's office was dimly lit, illuminated only by the blue glow of several computer screens. For days he had been immersed in a frantic investigation, determined to uncover the full extent of the conspiracy against his family. In this tense atmosphere, Miller burst through the door, panting and wide-eyed. "Richard," he gasped, "you need to see this." Richard looked up, alarmed at the urgency in his trusted investigator's voice. Miller placed a folder on the desk, scattering photographs and documents. "We've been tracing the origins of Chad's money, right? Well, we found something. Something big." Richard pored over the documents, his frown deepening as he absorbed the information. Bank transfers, property records, coded emails, all pointing to a name he hadn't seen in decades. "Evelyn," he whispered, incredulous. "Evelyn Sinclair?" Miller nodded grimly. "Your old college girlfriend. And there's more, Richard. She's Chad's mother." The world seemed to spin around Richard. Buried memories resurfaced. Evelyn, the brilliant economics student he had dated briefly before meeting his late wife. Evelyn, who vanished without a trace after they broke up. "It makes no sense," Richard murmured, running a hand through his gray hair. "Why would she?" But as he examined more documents, a dark picture emerged. Emails between Evelyn and Chad revealed a meticulous plan, years in the making. A plan of vengeance against Richard. "We need to confront them," Richard said, his voice loaded with resolve. "Now." Hours later, in a neutral conference room, Richard stared at Chad, and for the first time in decades, Evelyn Sinclair. Time had been kind to her, but her eyes glimmered with a calculating coldness he didn't recognize. "So," Evelyn began, a sardonic smile playing on her lips, "you finally figured it out. Took you longer than I expected, Richard." Richard fought to keep his composure. "Why, Evelyn? Why do all this?" Evelyn leaned forward, her eyes sparking with long-held anger. "You really don't know? You left me, Richard, pregnant and alone. You built your empire, your perfect family, while I struggled to survive." Her words hit Richard like a punch to the gut. I didn't know. You never told me." "Of course I didn't," Evelyn exploded. "You'd moved on, hadn't you? Married your precious wife, living your fairy tale, while I raised our son alone." Chad, who had remained silent until then, looked between them, confusion evident on his face. "Mom," he said, his voice trembling slightly, "what are you talking about?" Evelyn turned to her son, her expression softening momentarily. "James, sweetheart, Richard Sterling is your biological father." The silence that followed was deafening. Chad looked as though he'd been struck by lightning, his face a mask of shock and disbelief. "No," he muttered, shaking his head. That can't be true." Richard felt a whirlwind of conflicting emotions. Shock, guilt, anger. "Evelyn," he managed, his voice unsteady. "If I had known—" "It doesn't matter now," Evelyn interrupted coldly. "What matters is, I spent decades planning my revenge, watching you from a distance, waiting for the perfect moment." She turned to Chad, her tone softening. "I raised you to be strong, my son, to take what's rightfully yours." Chad looked as if his world was crumbling. "Marrying Emily?" he murmured. "Was that all planned?" Evelyn nodded. "Every detail. Bringing you into the family, gaining Richard's trust, and then destroying everything I built," Richard finished, realization striking him at last. "Locking Emily up, controlling the children and the company. All part of your plan." Evelyn smiled, cold and satisfied. "You were always brilliant at business, Richard, but so blind when it came to people." Richard felt the weight of decades of deception and manipulation. He looked at Chad, seeing for the first time not just the monster who tormented his family, but a man manipulated by a vengeance that began before he was even born. "Chad," he said gently, "I'm sorry for everything, if I had known." But Chad stood abruptly, his face twisted in fury and confusion. "No," he shouted, "don't try to play the father now. You have no right." Evelyn smirked, triumphant. "See, Richard? You've lost. Your empire, your family, all falling apart around you." Yet as he watched the scene unfold, Richard realized something. Evelyn's revenge, however elaborate, had a fatal flaw. She underestimated the power of love and truth. "You're wrong, Evelyn," he said, his voice gaining strength. "My family is stronger than you think. And now that the truth is out, we can start to heal." He turned to Chad, who still looked lost and furious. "Son," he said, the word feeling strange but filled with emotion, "I know I can't undo the past, but maybe we can build a future. Together, if you want." Chad hesitated, decades of anger and resentment warring with the sudden revelation of his true parentage. I need time," he finally muttered. Evelyn watched her carefully crafted revenge plan unraveling before her eyes. "Don't be a fool, Chad," she hissed. "Remember everything he did to us, all that we suffered." But Chad pulled away, leaving the room without looking back, abandoning Richard and Evelyn to face each other. "This isn't over," Evelyn threatened, her eyes aflame with rage. Richard nodded solemnly. "You're right. It's not over. But not in the way you planned, Evelyn. The truth is out now, and with it comes the chance for healing and redemption." As Evelyn stormed out, furious yet defeated, Richard felt a new challenge looming. How would he tell Emily and the girls about this shocking twist? How could he rebuild a family from the ashes of decades of lies? But for the first time in months, he felt a flicker of hope. The truth, no matter how painful, offered a path to healing, and Richard was determined to follow that path, however difficult it might be. Leaving the conference room, he made a call. "Emily, we need to talk. There's something you need to know." The future was uncertain, but one thing was clear. The Sterling family would face it together, stronger and more united than ever. A year had passed since that fateful morning at the Huntington estate. Autumn cloaked the trees in the garden with golden and crimson hues, a fitting metaphor for the transformation the family had undergone. Richard watched from his office window as Emily strolled through the garden, holding Lily and Grace's hands. The contrast between the Emily of a year ago fragile, frightened, and over-medicated, and the strong, radiant woman she was now, was striking. "Are you sure you're ready for this?" Richard asked softly, noticing the tension in his daughter's shoulders as she glanced toward the front door. Emily turned to him, a fierce determination shining in her eyes. "More than ready, Dad. It's time we close this chapter once and for all." Together, they walked to the entrance, their footsteps echoing in the morning's quiet. Richard noticed 2 cars parked outside, Chad's sports car and a sleek sedan he recognized as belonging to Evelyn. The final confrontation was about to begin. Entering the living room, they found Evelyn and Chad, both visibly tense and startled by the unexpected arrival. "Well, well," Evelyn said, her tone sickly sweet, her eyes cold as ice. What an unpleasant surprise. Chad remained silent, his gaze darting nervously between Richard and Emily, a mix of guilt, anger, and confusion swirling in his expression. Richard stepped forward, his posture straight and his voice steady. "It's over, Evelyn. We know everything. Your revenge plot, the manipulation, every sordid detail of your conspiracy." Evelyn laughed, a hollow sound that echoed in the room. "And what exactly do you plan to do about it, Richard? Expose it all and risk your precious empire? Your legacy?" "It's not about empires or legacies anymore, Evelyn," Emily answered this time, moving beside her father. Though her voice had been weak and hesitant only months ago, it now rang clear and strong. "It's about justice and protecting the people we love." Chad finally spoke, his voice unsteady with confusion. "Emily, I had no idea. Everything my mother told me." "Silence!" Evelyn hissed at her son, her eyes blazing. "Don't you dare waver now, not when we're so close." But it was too late. The seeds of doubt had already been planted in Chad, and years of manipulation were beginning to crumble. Richard saw the opening and seized it. "Chad," he said, softening his tone, "I know this is hard to believe, but you're a victim here too. Evelyn used you, just like she tried to use all of us." Evelyn advanced, her eyes dangerous. "Don't you dare turn him against me. I raised him, shaped him to be strong, to take what's rightfully his." "You shaped him into a weapon," Emily countered, her voice a mix of compassion and sorrow as she looked at Chad. "But he's more than that. He has his own choices, the capacity to change." The tension in the room crackled like electricity when suddenly the sound of small footsteps echoed down the hallway. To everyone's shock, Lily and Grace entered hand in hand, determined expressions on their young faces. "Mom? Grandpa?" Lily said, her voice trembling slightly but resolute. "We heard everything. We couldn't stay hidden while our family was in danger." Emily moved instinctively to shield her daughters, but Grace stepped forward, her wide eyes fixed on Evelyn and Chad. "Why did you hurt our family?" she asked, her childish voice carrying a wisdom and maturity that made all the adults' hearts clench. Families should love each other, not hurt and lie. The silence that followed was deafening. The innocence and raw truth in Grace's words seemed to strike something deep in Chad. He collapsed to his knees, tears streaming down his face. I'm sorry," he sobbed, looking from Emily to the girls. "I never wanted. I thought I was doing the right thing. Mom always said—" Evelyn stared at her son with a mix of contempt and disbelief. "Get up, you sentimental fool," she snarled. "Can't you see they're manipulating you? Everything we did was for you, for what's rightfully yours." But Chad shook his head, years of indoctrination finally cracking under the weight of truth and guilt. "No, Mother. The only one who's been manipulating me all these years is you. I've done terrible, unforgivable things." At that moment, the wail of sirens filled the air. Richard looked out the window to see several police cars approaching the mansion, lights flashing in the morning light. "It's over, Evelyn," he said, turning to his former college girlfriend with a mix of pity and determination. "We turned all the evidence over to the authorities. Every conspiratorial email, every suspicious bank transaction, every forged document. There's nowhere left to run." Evelyn visibly paled, though her eyes still sparked with a maniacal fury. "You have no idea how much power I've amassed over the years, Richard. This won't end well for you or your precious family." The front doors burst open, and Detective Harding entered, followed by heavily armed officers. "Evelyn Sinclair, Chad Huntington," he announced loudly. "You're under arrest for fraud, conspiracy, kidnapping, and multiple other charges. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in court." As Evelyn was handcuffed, shrieking a torrent of threats and accusations, Chad rose slowly. He looked at Richard, then at Emily and the twins, his eyes filled with remorse and shame. "I accept my punishment," he said quietly, "and I really am sorry. For everything. I know words can't undo what I've done, but I hope, maybe one day." Emily, in a surprising show of compassion that left Richard in awe, nodded. "Your real punishment will be living with the weight of your actions, Chad. But there's also room for redemption and forgiveness, if you truly seek them." As Chad was led away, still casting regretful glances back at them, Richard turned to his family. Emily hugged the twins, tears of relief and exhaustion shining in her eyes. He joined their embrace, feeling the weight of months of fear, anger, and uncertainty finally lifting. Detective Harding approached, his face reflecting a mixture of respect and sympathy. "Mr. Sterling, Ms. Sterling," he said quietly, "you've both been incredibly brave. We'll need detailed statements from each of you in the coming days. The legal process might be long and draining, but with the evidence we have and your cooperation, I'm confident justice will be served." Richard nodded, feeling simultaneously drained and invigorated. "Thank you, Detective. We'll be ready to cooperate fully. Our family has suffered enough from secrets and lies." While the police wrapped up the operation, collecting evidence and securing the scene, the Sterling family remained together in the middle of the living room. Lily looked up at her grandfather, her large, curious eyes also heavy with fatigue. "Grandpa," she asked softly, "what happens now? Can we go home?" Richard knelt to her level, offering a gentle smile. "Now, my darlings," he said, "we begin to heal. Together. Our home isn't a place. It's wherever we're together, as a family." Emily took Richard's hand, squeezing it gently. Her eyes, once clouded by fear and drug-induced confusion, now shone with clarity and resolve. "Dad," she said softly, "thank you. For never giving up. For fighting for us when I couldn't fight for myself." Richard felt a surge of emotion threaten to overwhelm him. "Always, my dear," he replied, his voice husky. "I'll always fight for you." As the family left the mansion, once the setting of so much suffering and betrayal, Richard looked up at the bright morning sky. The road ahead would be challenging, he knew. Lengthy court proceedings, painful therapy sessions, moments of doubt and fear. Emily's recovery would take time, and the girls would need constant support to overcome the trauma they had endured. But for the first time in a long while, Richard felt a genuine sense of hope blossoming in his chest. The conspiracy was dismantled, the perpetrators faced justice, and his family, what truly mattered, was united and safe. It was a new beginning, a chance not only to rebuild their individual lives, but to strengthen the bonds that held them together as a family. As they climbed into the car, ready to leave the dark past behind, Richard silently promised himself and them that he would devote every moment from then on to ensuring they never faced such a trial again. Love, truth, and justice had triumphed over greed and revenge, and with those pillars they would build a brighter, safer future. The final showdown was over, but the journey of healing, forgiveness, and redemption was only just beginning. And together, united by love and strengthened by the trials they had endured, the Sterling family stood ready to face whatever challenges the future held. 1 year had passed since that fateful morning at the Sterling mansion. Fall leaves colored the trees in the garden gold and red, a fitting reminder of how much the family had transformed. Richard watched through his office window as Emily walked hand in hand with Lily and Grace outside. The difference between the Emily of a year ago, vulnerable, terrified, and medicated, and the confident, vibrant woman today was remarkable. The sound of footsteps pulled him from his thoughts. Goldberg, his attorney, entered, holding a folder and smiling. "It's done, Richard," he announced. "The final verdict is in." Evelyn got 25 years without the possibility of parole. Chad, given his remorse and cooperation, got 10 years with a chance for early release on good behavior. Richard nodded, a mixture of relief and sadness washing over him. And the others? The clinic's doctors, the corrupt executives, all convicted. Justice was served, my friend. After Goldberg left, Richard refocused on the garden. Emily was now chasing after Lily and Grace, their laughter carrying on the breeze. It was a sound he once feared he'd never hear again. Emily's recovery had been slow and sometimes painful, weeks of detox, months of intense therapy. But her inner strength, together with the family's unwavering support, brought her back. 2 months ago, she officially resumed control of Sterling Enterprises, bringing new energy and vision to the company. The twins, for their part, thrived in ways Richard hardly dared to hope for. With the help of specialized therapists and the family's constant love, Lily and Grace gradually overcame their trauma. Today, they were lively, confident girls, eager to explore the world. Richard descended the stairs and stepped outside, smiling at the sight of the 3 most important women in his life. "Grandpa!" Grace cried, dashing toward him. "Come play with us!" Laughing, Richard joined their game, chasing and being chased by the giggling twins. Emily watched with eyes shining in happiness. Later, while the girls napped in the living room, Richard and Emily sat on the porch, enjoying the peaceful afternoon. "Dad," Emily began softly, "I got a letter from Chad today." Richard straightened, surprised. "What did it say?" Emily smiled sadly. "He's really trying to change. He's in therapy, taking classes. He apologized again, asked if one day when he's out, he could try to rebuild some sort of relationship with the girls." Richard was silent for a moment, thinking. "What do you think about that?" "I think forgiveness is powerful," Emily answered, gazing at the horizon. "It doesn't mean forgetting or excusing what happened, but it sets us free. And maybe it gives Chad the chance for redemption he needs." Richard nodded, feeling a surge of pride and admiration for his daughter. "You're stronger and wiser than I ever was, my dear." Emily took her father's hand, squeezing gently. "I learned from the best, Dad. Your strength and determination saved us, and your love helped us heal." The following weeks brought more positive changes. Inspired by her own healing journey, Emily proposed a new project for the company, a foundation dedicated to helping victims of abuse and psychological manipulation. Richard couldn't have been prouder. On a bright afternoon, the entire Sterling family gathered in the garden for a picnic. And as Richard watched Emily help the twins make flower crowns, he reflected on the lessons they had learned over the past year. Life could be unpredictable and cruel at times, but the family's love was a powerful force, capable of overcoming the toughest hardships and healing even the deepest wounds. He had learned never to take anything for granted, to cherish every moment with loved ones. "What are you thinking, Grandpa?" asked Lily, placing a daisy chain on his head. Richard smiled, pulling her into a hug. "How lucky I am to have all of you in my life." Grace joined the hug, followed by Emily. For a moment, they simply held each other, feeling the warmth and love that bound them. "How about a photo?" Emily suggested, picking up her phone. They posed, genuine smiles lighting up their faces. Richard with a granddaughter on each side, Emily behind them, her arms enveloping the group. The camera's click captured more than just an image. It captured a moment of pure happiness, of peace finally won after the storm. A family that had faced the worst and emerged stronger, closer. As the sun dipped low, painting the sky pink and orange, Richard felt a wave of deep gratitude. They had been through the fire and emerged purified, not broken. The future, once so frightening and uncertain, now shone with promise and hope. The girls' laughter echoed across the Sterling garden, mingling with birdsong. Emily, her eyes alight with joy, proposed a toast with lemonade glasses. "To family," she said, raising her glass, "to the love that heals, forgives, and endures." To family they all echoed, the glasses clinking gently. And as dusk settled gently over the Sterling estate, Richard knew that no matter what the future held, they would face it together, stronger, wiser, and united by the unbreakable bond of family love.